It started like an ordinary evening at a quiet downtown diner, where the hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of plates and the hiss of coffee machines. A single father named Mark sat alone in a corner booth, his tired hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. His work uniform still smelled faintly of oil and metal, evidence of another long shift at the auto shop. The world outside the diner windows glowed in streaks of orange and blue as the sun dipped behind skyscrapers. But for Mark, it wasn't the colors of the sky that caught his attention, it was the faint, trembling voice behind him that would change everything that night. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" The words were barely more than a whisper, almost lost in the chatter of the diner. But they hit Mark like a thunderclap. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Standing there was a little girl, no more than 7, her clothes wrinkled and too thin for the cool evening breeze that slipped through the door each time a customer left. Her small fingers clutched the strap of a worn-out bag, and her wide, hopeful eyes flickered between Mark's face and the half-eaten sandwich on his plate. It wasn't hunger that froze him, it was the innocence in her voice, the kind of voice that doesn't beg, only asks because it has run out of every other option. Mark's first instinct was disbelief. He scanned the diner, expecting to see her parents nearby, but there was no one. The servers looked away awkwardly, and the few late-night diners avoided eye contact. He could tell from their silence that they'd seen her before. The girl's face had become part of the background of hardship that busy people chose not to see. But for Mark, who had once been a child not too different from her, alone, hungry, and unsure of tomorrow, it was impossible to look away. He pushed his plate forward. "Of course, sweetheart," he said softly, his throat tight. "It's all yours." The girl's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, she smiled, a smile that could have melted the coldest heart. She climbed into the booth across from him, careful not to make a mess, and began eating slowly, politely, as if afraid of being scolded. Mark couldn't help but watch her, wondering what kind of world left a child to fend for herself in such a way. But then, something unexpected happened. The bell above the diner door jingled, and a woman entered. She wasn't just any woman, her presence changed the entire air of the room. She wore a tailored coat, her heels clicked confidently against the tiled floor, and her eyes, sharp but kind, seemed to take in every detail. People straightened in their seats as if her very presence demanded respect. She was known to some regulars as Victoria Hale, a reclusive millionaire who rarely appeared in public without reason. Her reputation was one of brilliance, mystery, and quiet generosity. Victoria's eyes landed on the little girl almost immediately. There was something in her gaze that softened, a flicker of memory perhaps, or recognition of pain she'd once known. She walked closer, her expression unreadable. Mark noticed the shift in the girl's demeanor, her small shoulders tensed, her chewing slowed, and her eyes darted between Victoria and the door, like a wild bird sensing danger. "Is she bothering you, sir?" Victoria asked gently. Her voice was calm but carried authority. Mark shook his head. "No, ma'am. She just asked for some food. She's hungry." The millionaire's gaze moved to the plate, then back to the girl. "Is that so?" she murmured. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, her lips trembling slightly before whispering, "Lila." Victoria knelt down beside her. "Lila," she repeated softly, as if testing the name. "Where are your parents?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. Lila looked down, her small hands clutching the crust of the sandwich. "I don't have any," she said. "It's just me." The diner grew quieter. Even the waitress behind the counter paused mid-step. Mark felt his chest tighten. He'd seen poverty, he'd lived through loss, but something about the way that child spoke, so matter-of-fact, broke something inside him. Victoria straightened slowly, her expression unreadable. But when her eyes met Mark's, there was something electric, a spark of understanding between two people who had seen life from opposite sides. The millionaire who had everything and the single father who had almost nothing were suddenly united by a shared sense of helplessness before a world that allowed children like Lila to go hungry. Mark's thoughts raced. He wondered if he should call social services, if the diner owner could help, if maybe someone was already looking for this little girl. But before he could speak, Victoria reached into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and placed a few bills on the counter. "I'll pay for his meal," she said softly. "And hers too." The act was simple, but it carried weight. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but she silenced him with a small, knowing smile. "Let's not call it charity," she said. "Let's call it kindness." Then, something about her tone, something warm and slightly trembling, caught his attention. For the first time, he noticed the faint loneliness in her eyes. Despite her wealth, despite her poise, there was an emptiness there, one that mirrored his own on long nights when his daughter was asleep and the apartment felt too quiet. Victoria sat down across from Mark and Lila, motioning for a new plate to be brought over. "No child should ever have to ask for leftovers," she said quietly. "Not in this city. Not anywhere." Mark nodded, unsure what to say. He studied her for a moment, the expensive coat, the careful makeup, the woman who probably dined in places far grander than this little diner, and yet here she was, sharing a table with a mechanic and an orphaned girl. It didn't feel real. But it was. As they sat in silence for a moment, the clatter of the diner fading into background noise, a quiet sense of something extraordinary settled between them. This wasn't just an act of kindness. It was the start of a connection, a collision of three broken lives, each unknowingly about to change the other's forever. By the time the food arrived, Mark realized he wasn't just looking at a little girl in need, or a millionaire passing through. He was witnessing the start of something miraculous. And somewhere in that mix of pain, hunger, and compassion, the single dad understood that destiny doesn't always come knocking with answers, it sometimes whispers through the eyes of a stranger asking for leftovers. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed with hushed voices. What had happened the previous night had already spread beyond the kitchen walls. The story of the quiet waitress who had corrected Adrian Vale, the man everyone feared, was now the topic of every whispered conversation. Some admired her bravery, others thought she was doomed. People argued whether she would even make it to her next shift. The golden table had seen many employees come and go, most of them leaving silently after crossing the wrong line. But Lena's act wasn't ordinary, it had disrupted a pattern that had ruled the restaurant for years. The only question was how the billionaire would respond. Adrian Vale was not a man who tolerated defiance. His world ran on rules, precision, and control. To him, success was built on maintaining order, and order required fear. But that night, something about Lena's calm defiance had unsettled him. He hadn't lost his temper, but her words had replayed in his mind long after he left the restaurant. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There was no challenge in her tone, no disrespect, only quiet certainty. She hadn't tried to humiliate him, and yet somehow, she had made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, self-doubt that he had built his career by trusting only his own instincts. People either obeyed him or left. He had no time for explanations or second chances. But now, he found himself replaying that small moment, the stillness of her expression, the steadiness in her hands. He realized that while everyone else in his world had feared him, she had simply done her job correctly. And that truth unsettled him more than anger ever could. By midday, the restaurant staff had fallen into uneasy silence, waiting for news. Lena came in quietly, as always, though she could feel dozens of eyes on her. Every coworker she passed looked at her with a strange mixture of admiration and pity. She didn't know whether she should expect a termination notice or another chance. She told herself she had done nothing wrong, that she had spoken only the truth, but her heart still raced. Fear lingered even when you believed you had been right. Hours passed, and still no word came from the office upstairs. It wasn't until evening that the manager approached her, face unreadable, and told her that Mr. Vale wanted to see her. The walk to his office felt longer than it should have. Every step echoed like a warning. She knocked softly, and his voice, steady and deep, told her to enter. Inside, the billionaire sat behind his desk, the same composure on his face as always. The silence stretched between them. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, unsure what was expected. He studied her for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, his words were slow, deliberate, almost cautious. He told her he had reviewed her service reports, checked the guidelines she had mentioned, and discovered she was indeed correct about the placement standard. There was no apology in his tone, but there was no anger either. He asked her why she had chosen to speak up when she could have simply apologized like everyone else. She hesitated, then replied that she respected the rules of her work and didn't want to misrepresent the standards she had been trained to follow. Her voice was soft, but it carried a quiet conviction that filled the room. Adrian said nothing for a while. Then, unexpectedly, he thanked her. It was a single word, spoken so simply that it stunned her. He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened for just a moment. He dismissed her after that, but the meeting left a strange weight in the air. When she returned to the main floor, the staff stared, waiting for her reaction, but she said nothing. All she said was that she had spoken with him and that it was fine. Nobody believed it could really be that simple, but over the next few days, the atmosphere began to shift. For the first time, Adrian Vale started noticing the people behind the uniforms. He began observing instead of commanding, asking instead of ordering. It wasn't a sudden transformation. He was still strict, still precise, still the perfectionist everyone knew. But he was quieter, more thoughtful. On several occasions, he asked Lena small questions, about procedures, about service details, about things he'd never bothered to ask anyone before. It became clear to everyone that her courage had left an impression on him. The change didn't go unnoticed. The staff, who had once walked in fear, began to feel a small, unfamiliar sense of ease. They still worked with discipline, but now there was less tension in their movements. Mistakes were corrected, not punished. Conversations returned to the kitchen, laughter crept back into the air. Lena, who had once blended into the background, had become a quiet symbol of strength. She didn't seek attention, didn't brag, didn't even speak of the incident again. But everyone knew it had been her courage that broke the silence that had ruled their lives for too long. One evening, as the restaurant prepared for another high-profile event, Adrian called a brief staff meeting. Everyone stood in careful rows, expecting another set of orders. But instead, he spoke about standards, teamwork, and respect. He said that excellence didn't come from fear, but from pride in one's work. His tone was measured, but sincere. It wasn't the kind of speech anyone had ever expected from him. When it ended, there was a long, stunned silence, followed by hesitant applause. The staff exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. But beneath their confusion was relief. They had seen something change, not just in their boss, but in the place itself. For Lena, life at the Golden Table gradually settled into something resembling normalcy. She kept working hard, serving quietly, just as before. But now, people looked at her differently. The chefs respected her. The manager consulted her about small details. Even Adrian, on rare occasions, would offer a brief nod of acknowledgement as he passed. She never sought validation, but she couldn't deny the sense of quiet pride that came with knowing she had done the right thing when it mattered most. Over the following weeks, rumors began to circulate outside the restaurant. Word spread through the hospitality circles about the billionaire who had been corrected by a waitress and had accepted it with grace. Some exaggerated the story, turning it into gossip, but those who knew the truth understood its meaning. It wasn't about humiliation or rebellion. It was about integrity, about the simple power of someone choosing honesty over fear. Adrian's empire continued to grow, but those closest to him noticed that his leadership began to change. He started promoting employees who showed initiative, rewarding skill rather than submission. When asked in a later interview about his management philosophy, he surprised everyone by saying, "Sometimes the smallest voices carry the truest lessons." He didn't mention Lena by name, but the people at the Golden Table knew who he was talking about, and so, the shy waitress who had once been invisible became, without ever intending to, a quiet force of change. She hadn't raised her voice or defied her boss with anger. She had simply spoken the truth with dignity. In a world that often mistakes silence for weakness, she had proven that calmness could be stronger than authority. The restaurant continued to shine, its gold reflecting not just wealth but a new kind of respect. Behind the polished tables and soft music, a lesson lingered in every corner, that even in places ruled by fear, one act of courage could rewrite the rules entirely.